My name's Kundnani. I am the editorial director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a pan-European think tank based in London. If the euro were to break up, several people, not just Ferguson but others, have suggested that the way this might happen is by Germany leaving the euro rather than the Eurozone as a whole kicking out some countries like Greece. And so in that sense, then, if the Eurozone breaks up, and Merkel, for example, has talked about how the future of the Eurozone is the future of the EU as a whole. If that were to happen, then perhaps that's what Neil Ferguson means when he says that Germany would be responsible for the breakup of Europe. I think in a broader context, it seems a little bit simplistic to me in the sense that one of the things I think that characterises the euro crisis is its complexity. It's a series of different crises. So on the one hand, you have a debt crisis, a sovereign debt crisis in countries like Greece. At the same time, you have a banking crisis, which is not only in countries like Greece, but it also, for example, affects German banks. Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank are two of the biggest lenders to Greece, along with French banks like SocGen. So this is, in a sense, a Europe-wide banking crisis as well. The German Landesbanken are also in trouble. So I think it would be wrong to sort of oversimplify the crisis. It's this connection of several different crises at the same time, which makes it so difficult. The idea of the euro is very much that this would enable European economies to converge in a way that they hadn't done before. What's actually happened, though, since the creation of the single currency is that partly because of the way that the currency was constructed, actually the European economies have diverged rather than converged. So the imbalances, the economic imbalances between different members of the Eurozone, in particular between creditor countries and debtor countries, and in a sense between the North and the South, have actually grown. And what I think we've seen in the last 2 years since the Greek crisis first emerged at the beginning of 2010, is that it's become apparent these economic imbalances have grown, and that the single currency has really no mechanism to actually deal with those imbalances. And what we're seeing really now, I think, is the fallout from that. Really, from German reunification in 1871 onwards, there was this German question. How do you deal with this country in Europe that's essentially too big for a balance of power, but too small and not powerful enough for hegemony? The German question really dominated Europe until World War II, and then after that it appeared to have been resolved by the division of Germany and by the integration of the Federal Republic, at least, into the West. Recently, there's been much discussion in the last year or two, since the Euro crisis in particular, of a kind of a new German question, a re-emergence of the German question. It strikes me that insofar as there has been a re-emergence of the German question, it's in geo-economic rather than geopolitical form. As I mentioned, Germany can increasingly, I think, be seen as a geo-economic power. And I think it would be wrong to suggest that somehow Germany is geopolitically a problem within Europe in a way that it was in the 19th century. Germany remains bound into the West. It's a EU member state. It's a partner within NATO and will remain so. In that sense, geopolitically, Germany is no longer a threat in the way that it used to be. In the past, Bismarck's fear, for example, was of the so-called cauchemar de coalition, the nightmare of coalitions in which Germany would be surrounded. And obviously, this is eventually what happened with the during World War II, for example, and where you have the Russians, the Germans are fighting on the one hand the Soviet Union, on the other hand the Western powers, including France. Now, in contrast to that, Germany is surrounded on all sides by trading partners. It's not surrounded by enemies in the way that it used to be. As I say, in geopolitical terms, Germany is now completely benign. However, the same questions that were being asked in the 19th century about Germany's role in Europe are now, in a sense, being asked, but specifically in relation to the German economy. German economy, again, is as Germany geopolitically used to be, is too big for the rest of Europe in a sense, but not big enough that it can simply exercise hegemony over the rest of Europe and over the rest of the Eurozone in particular. So I think, in a sense, you can think of the new German question that is now being discussed as being a geoeconomic one. What's emerged since the Greek crisis is a new Germany which is more powerful within the Eurozone than it was before, partly because of its own economic development since reunification. It's been successful in terms of not just coping with the costs of reunification, but also in terms of undergoing structural reforms in its own economy, that in particular Gerhard Schröder, when he was Chancellor, was successful in pushing through. And those have, in particular through maintaining wage levels, wage restraint, have actually boosted German exports. So what's happened in the last decade, partly as a result of the euro itself and partly as a result of these structural reforms in Germany, is that that German exporters have boomed and have become a bigger part of the German economy than they were before. Germany was always an exporter throughout the whole of its post-war history. It was a big exporter. But what's happened in the last decade is that 2/3 of Germany's GDP growth has come from exports, which is a disproportionate share of GDP growth. And so Germany's become very reliant on exports, and at the same time, southern European economies, in particular, which benefited in different ways from the creation of the euro, were able to buy German goods. That's in turn boosted German exports even more. But that's led eventually to the situation we have now, where these very indebted economies, particularly on the periphery and in the south of Europe, are now in trouble. The sort of lack of commitment by some NATO members echoes very much what US Defence Secretary Robert Gates has been saying recently as well. He talked about the demilitarisation of Europe and about the danger of a creation of a two-tier NATO. And neither Gates nor Rasmussen really points a finger particularly at Germany, but it's hard to read either of their interventions without thinking of Germany. Because of the discrepancy, I think, between its size and power in Europe, economic power that is, and the contribution that it makes to NATO military interventions. Obviously, there's the abstention on Libya that I mentioned a minute ago, but this has also been very much of an issue in Afghanistan, where although Germany does have over 6,000 troops, they're stationed in the north, the relatively safe north of Afghanistan, and they operate under a series of caveats, which makes it very difficult to use them in operations. And this is to minimise casualties. And really what's happened in Germany is that during the first year after reunification, it seemed that Germany was converging with France and the UK on the question of use of military force. And in particular, the Kosovo War was a critical juncture in which Germany sent troops into combat for the first time since World War II. And And as I say, at that time, it seemed as if Germany was becoming more normal, in quotes, in that sense. What subsequently happened, though, is during the last decade, I think, that in a sense Germany's almost gone backwards on the question of military force, and attitudes to the use of military force have hardened against it. An interesting lacuna in Germany's attitude to this question of military force is that the German arms industry has, during the last decade, boomed along with the rest of its export industry that I mentioned earlier, that provides has provided two-thirds of Germany's GDP growth in the last year. So in the last couple of weeks, for example, there's been a lot of debate in Germany about a deal to sell 200 Leopard 2 tanks to Saudi Arabia. So you have this juxtaposition between Germany's abstention to the use of military force in Libya, and then at the same time or shortly afterwards, this tank deal to send tanks to Saudi Arabia, which had sent troops to put down the pro-democracy protests in Bahrain, and this conjuncture of these two events led people to say, this is Germany's contribution to the Arab Spring, this arms deal. So I think that illustrates again the interesting paradox that on the one hand Germany is very opposed to the use of military force, but at the same time is quite prepared to pursue its national interests, particularly its economic interests, which increasingly, because of the role that exports play in the German economy, are defined in terms of the needs of exporters.